Oh, yeah, this is Paul the Pipe Guy. And I've come down with a sinus infection. But so I got the next few days off. But I want to talk a little bit about my childhood. And I want to do it smoking a cigar. We have these Banditos cigarellos. They're from Honduras. They're 32 gauge, and I put them in here on 10/29 of 2021. So this video is a tribute to one of my mentors from early back. In the days. I was born in 1964. Oh, those smell good. They've been in this mason jar ever since. I got them. So, nobody can tell the story. Probably nobody has. But I will. So, and I don't know how long this video is going to last. But it's almost like a Christmas Eve story. These Banditos are good. Let's start something on fire. So I got a sinus infection here. Banditos. Yeah. So enough of that. Let me sit back in my chair. I normally don't do that, but I'm not feeling up to par. Yeah. So, Mr. Gray. Let's start out with the bike. Back in the summer of 1969, I got my first bike. It didn't have training wheels. I don't remember what make it was. It might have been a Schwinn. I definitely wasn't a Murray. I think it might have been a Schwinn. And I remember it. I remember when I got the bike. It wasn't for my birthday because that's in December. But anyways, I got the bike. Let's just put it that way. And I got this brand new bike. And it was 1969. All the boys were heading off to Vietnam. I got my first bike. And I remember, I don't remember if it was a 20-inch or a 24-inch, it doesn't matter. But it had ape hanger handlebars, which meant the handlebars went up like that, so my arms were up. And it had a gold sparkle banana seat, which was about that long. You can Google it. I'm telling this story to all the old folks. You young'uns, whatever you don't understand, you can look up on the computer. And it had a sissy bar on the back. And the back tire was a slick, meaning the tire was round, but it had no tread. And it had a red line going all the way around that big black tire, red line tire. And the front is kind of popped up a little bit, kind of like a chopper. And the paint was a beautiful lizard green metal flake paint. This bike was made in the USA. It was gorgeous, and those ape hanger handlebars came up, and it had beautiful, gorgeous green rubber sparkly handlebars or handle grips made out of real rubber. All right. So this was kind of a race car. Well, I learned how to ride that without training wheels. They didn't have that on that bike, and so I guess it got pushed down the hill a few times and crashed and burned or whatever. Finally, all of a sudden, I was riding it. I rode that bike till I was 18 years old. From the time I was like 5 till I was 18. I love that bike. So let's get back in touch with Mr. Gray. All right, so I got that bike in 1969. I rode the heck out of that bike. Now you got bearings and you got moving parts on that bike that after a while they tend to wear out. So somewhere circa 1973, all of a sudden the front tire wasn't spinning right and the back tire wasn't spinning right and the pedal crank wasn't doing what it should do, and I was like, dang, and it all started with a flat tire, and my dad worked a lot, so he had no time to fix this stuff. So one of the neighbor boys said, there's a guy down the street named Mr. Gray. Take your bike down there and I'll help you fix it. So I wheeled my bike down there. I think my first repair was a flat tire. I didn't know how to do it. And so I wheeled it down. I rung the doorbell, and it was a white house. And I believe the guy was a retired engineer from General Motors or something. And he says, yes, what can I do for you, young man? And I was like, well, are you Mr. Gray? Yes, I am. I says, well, my name is Paul. My dad always taught us to look somebody in the eye and to shake their hand hard, and that's what I did. And he's like, what seems to be the problem? Well, I have a flat tire, Mr. Gray. Oh, okay, well, let's bring it down into the shop. You can carry it. So, of course, being a young lad, probably only about 75 pounds, I was able to lift this bike, and he was, at the time, he seemed like an old man, but he was probably younger than me. Because I'm going to be 59, and you could retire from General Motors at 55. So, carried my bike down into his basement where the workshop was, and he's like, let's see what we have here. Took the front tire off, took the tire off of the rim, filled a wash basin up with water, pumped the tire up, held it down there, and he's like, Paulie, I want you to look at me, so next time you'll be able to repair this. So he not only repaired it, but he taught me how to repair it. Now, I don't know if he did that with all the kids or not. He's like, watch this. He squeezed the tube under the water, and I saw bubbles come up. He's like, that's where the air's escaping from the tube. He'd pull it up out of the water. He had a piece of chalk, and he'd mark where the hole was. Then he'd dry it all off, and he says, all right, we're going to patch it. You got money on you? I says, yes, sir. He's like, well, it's going to be 50 cents for a patch. Do you have 50 cents? Yes, Mr. Gray, I do. Okay. So he did what he had to do. And at that time, patches, I won't get into it, but he cut off a piece of patch. He had this glue, put it on where he put the X where the hole was in it. And then he started it on fire. And it melted onto the tube. And he went and blew it out. He's like, now pay attention, Paulie, because next time I want you to learn how to do this yourself. Then he put it back in the water, pumped it up. No air bubbles came out. Put everything back on the rim, put the tire back on. He's like, watch how I do this. Then I watched in amazement, and my bike was fixed. Well, as the years rolled by, which I thought was a long time, but it was only a couple, 2-3 years. And now this bicycle had become maybe about 5 years old. All of a sudden, other things started wearing out because back in the 70s, we rode our bikes all over the place and nobody taught us how to maintain them or anything. But so I went down and I was like, well, my front tire isn't moving so good, Mr. Gray. He says, I'll bring it downstairs. So, of course, I took it downstairs, took it off, took it apart. He's like, oh, your 2 front wheel bearings are gone, just like on a car. I said, okay, Mr. Gray, what do we do? He says, well, first of all, every spring you ought to be taking this apart like we did. And you ought to put grease in there, because that's maintenance. If you did your proper maintenance on it, you wouldn't be bringing it to me with worn out bearings. Grease tends to dry out sometimes. So he's like, here's what we're going to do. We're going to fix this for you, Paulie. And so goes over to his workbench. And above his workbench, he had manuals. It looked like, oh my gosh, it looked like an attorney's office. It looked like a lawyer's office. Thick manuals all across for every different bike. He looked at my bike, he pulled that one down and had every part in it. The one he pulled down, I think it was a Schwinn 1964 to 1974, I don't know. Slowly opened up the pages. Yep. Here's the part number. We need 2 of these bearings. I said, oh, okay, Mr. Gray. He says, well, I'm going to send a letter to the manufacturer. Back then, they didn't have the internet. They didn't have somebody you could just call up and give a credit card to, because credit cards were fairly new then. So he's like, well, the part's 25 cents. And you need 2 of them. That's 50 cents. Plus, the stamp is, I think back then it was 10 cents. So he says that's 60 cents. And then you can pay me for my labor later. He says, do you have 60 cents, Paulie? Yep. Because I always worked. Gave him 2 quarters and a dime. And I remember him watching him write the part numbers down and writing a letter to the manufacturer saying what parts he needed, the part number. It was archaic back then, but it was nice. I watched him lick the stamp, put it on, put the letter with what he needed in there, and a check. He wrote on a check for 60 cents and put that in there and licked it, And he says, all right, when you're on your way out home, he says, put this in my mailbox and pull the flag up. And he says, check back with me in about 2 weeks. So I did that. Check back in about 2 weeks. He's like, oh, the parts aren't in yet. Check back with me in another week. Check back with him in another week. He's like, yep, got everything right here. Now, he didn't just fix it. But I don't know if he did this with all the neighborhood boys, but he wanted me to learn how to fix a bike and maintain it. He's like, all right, Paulie, here's the bearings that we got. And he took them out of the wrapper, and they didn't have plastic back then. They were in like a manila wrapper that was all grease filled and everything, and in a piece of paper folded up. And he's like, all right, we got to put some grease in there, and showed me how to do it. And all right, we got to put some grease on this one to go in this side. All right, we're going to put the front tire on, and he showed me how to adjust the tension because you couldn't tighten certain things up too tight. I won't get into it. Otherwise, you just weren't doing the proper job. And he taught me. And I said to him, I says, well, Mr. Gray, I says, thank you for fixing the bike. How much do I owe you for labor? He's like, I got this garbage can that's full down here. Why don't you take my garbage, Paulie, up and put it in my garbage can, haul that out to the road, and we'll call it even. Now, this was a guy, I never saw him drink and never saw him smoke. I don't think he did at all. But he taught me all these things, and or my chain would fall off, and he would teach me how to realign the back wheel with the sprocket, all of this stuff. And, he was a mentor to me, and I paid for parts, and I worked off the labor. Like I said before, I don't know if he did that with all the neighbor kids, but that always served me well. I know how to, tonight my first wife, I got 5 grandkids with her, and she's like, do you know how to fix a flat tire, and do you know how to put a chain back on a bike because they keep falling off? I don't know how to do that. And the kids want their bikes. And I was like, yeah, I know how to do all that. And I want to thank Mr. Gray for that. So I'm now that old man that's doing that. And he's the one that taught me. When I was a teenager, and we had moved from where Mr. Gray was at to another part of the Rochester area, I used to go into the junkyard. I'd grab old bikes out of the junkyard that had been bulldozed under the dirt. I'd pull them out, 3 or 4 of them, and carry them home. I'd take this part from this one, that part from that one, and used my dad's grease, and I'd build like an awesome, unbelievable pedal bike that'd go really fast. You'd put the smallest sprocket that you could find on the back wheel, the biggest one you could put on the front, pedals. And that made the fastest bike. You'd have to have a lot of strength to do that. But the gear ratio was such, the guy taught me to be a bicycle engineer and repair Man, yeah. So now I can do that. There's a bad story that I got, when I was a young man living in a apartment complex. There was all these bikes that were broken, misaligned, this and that. And one day I had a day off, and there was a little boy out there, and he was trying to ride his bike, and the chain kept falling off. And I says, young man, he was probably about 3 or 4, had training wheels, which I never had. I says, what's going on with your bike? He's like, it's broken. I says, I'll tell you what, I'll fix it. So I fixed it. Now, all of a sudden, I get a knock on the door later that night, and it's his mother. She's like, you fixed my son's bike? I says, yes, ma'am, I did. She says, he's riding all over. Nobody else could fix that. We didn't know what to do with it. She says, I want to cook you a nice dinner tonight. I says, well, that'd be mighty fine. She said, yeah, I want to cook you a nice dinner. What would you like? And I says, whatever you make should be fine. Back then, women knew how to cook. She says, well, why don't you come on up about 6 o'clock? So I went up there and I had myself a nice dinner and got to watch a movie and her little man. Well, eventually the little man went to bed. And all of a sudden, about 5 or 6 different mothers there. There was this huge bike rack, and all these bikes were broken and stuff. And I was getting knocks on the door and calls and all kinds of stuff in this apartment complex. And they all wanted me to fix their little boys' bikes, and I was like, okay, I'd fix it. Didn't want nothing for it. And same thing, 5, 6 different young ladies. We're all in our 20s back then. Fix some bikes, and one at a time, and they'd all be like, oh, thank you, Mr. Paul. Why don't I cook you dinner tonight? Well, that'd be mighty fine. And then Junior went to bed. That happened 5 or 6 times. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Gray, for getting me in trouble. Because eventually, they all found out about one another. Now, I wasn't doing nothing wrong. But if they all wanted to cook me dinner for thanks for fixing their boy's bike, and, all of a sudden maybe they thought I was their boyfriend or something like that. I don't know. That's the truth. Oh, yeah. Well, thank you, Mr. Gray. You were never long-winded, but I am. We've gone on for 22 minutes. Over and out. Hope you enjoyed the video.